afternoon, good evening, dear participants from around the world. Welcome our distinguished panel speakers to this high-level panel on science policy measures to protect ecosystems from emerging pollutants of the UNESCO IWRA International Online Conference on Emerging Pollutants. I'm Sarantuyaa Zandaryaa, a program specialist in the Division of Water Sciences, the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program of UNESCO. I will be moderating this high-level panel together with my co-moderator, Karishma Asoodani, who is an international journalist and water youth advocate, and also supported by Ms. Tatiana Dimitrieva, who is the rapporteur of this high-level panel, and Tatiana is also from the Division of Water Sciences of UNESCO. So I would like to invite my co-moderator to introduce our distinguished panel. Over to you, Karishma.
Thank you very much, Sarantuyaa. But before we go on introducing our panelists, just some important information for our viewers. Firstly, just to remind all our speakers that the session is being recorded. For our viewers, we invite you to submit your questions in English via the Q&A button. You can find this button just at the bottom of your screen on the website. We will address your questions as much as possible after the talk or as a part of the question and answer session that's going to be at the end of the panel. You will see each question once it is answered, either verbally or in writing, when they will be displayed for everyone to see. As evidently you see, we have a huge audience participating. So if we don't have the time to answer all the questions we receive, over, of course, the duration of the panel, then we will aim to collect written responses from our speakers and get them uploaded on the website for your future reference. Please note that the chat box is disabled during this session. However, we ask you to keep an eye out for any useful messages that may be shared in the chat box from the moderators or the speakers. You also have the option of switching on the automatic subtitles at the bottom of your screen if you have any difficulty hearing. Just a last piece of information that if you experience any technical problems, then you can check the Zoom Help Center or send an email to online.conference@iwra.org for assistance. I'll also just put that in the information section for you to access. Well, it's a lovely day, of course, and starting with the high-level panel, which Sarantuyaa will be, of course, moderating, I'd like to introduce all the speakers and viewers and participants. We are, of course, happy to have and joined by Mr. Omar Elhassan, environmental antimicrobial resistance and water management expert, United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. We also have Richard Elelman, coordinator, World Water Quality Alliance, United Nations Environment Program. We're also joined by, on this high-level panel, Jennifer Molwantwa, CEO, that is Chief Executive Officer for Water Research Commission, South Africa. And we also have Ting Ruan, Professor, Research Center for Eco-Environmental Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Welcome, speakers, and I now request my co-moderator to take the dais.
Thank you, Karishma. Welcome again, our distinguished panel speakers. So I will start with my question to Dr. Omar Elhassan. So you are an environmental antimicrobial resistance and water management expert at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. Several presentations during the sessions addressed the issues of antimicrobial resistance. So my question to you is specifically addressed about the role of agricultural sector in addressing emerging pollutants, more specifically about addressing veterinary pharmaceuticals, which represent a major group of emerging pollutants. And we know that large quantities of residual pharmaceuticals enter water with agricultural runoff from farmers, which is itself a major environmental problem. But also researchers indicate that pharmaceuticals in the aquatic environment contribute to other much more serious problems, such as environmental antimicrobial resistance. So could you please share your expert's view on environmental antimicrobial resistance and how it links to pharmaceuticals in aquatic ecosystems, and also what are the best strategies to mitigate both environment like antimicrobial resistance and reduce pharmaceuticals in agricultural runoff, given that large quantities of antibiotics are used on farms? So over to you, Dr. Omar Elhassan.
Thank you very much. I'd first like to say I'm honored to be invited to this high-level panel and to talk about these important issues. And thank you to the co-moderators. And I know that there have been some discussions already about antimicrobial resistance, AMR, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, just to give a background of AMR and what it refers to, meaning AMR referring to microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites that can become resistant to antimicrobials through a variety of mechanisms, such as mutation, genetic exchange, acquired resistance, and so forth. And in the environment, we have seen in the last years an increased discussion of the importance of the environment as a reservoir of resistance and a high potential for transmission to both humans and animals. There has traditionally been a lot more emphasis on the human health and animal health aspects, but we're now starting to realize as a global community that the environment plays a very important role in antimicrobial resistance. And in terms of water, sanitation, and hygiene and wastewater, they play very large roles in environmental dispersal and transmission of AMR. And I would say in three main ways, especially through dispersal via water, sludge, and manure, potentially resulting in the transmission of disease-causing pathogens to humans, animals, and plants, and then therefore increasing the need for treatment with antimicrobial agents. The silent transmission of resistant organisms with low pathogenicity that only become evident when they infect particularly vulnerable populations or their genes are transferred to pathogens causing infection. And that the third way, through the release of fecal and other pollutants, including antimicrobial compounds, into the environment, such as excreta from use in humans or in terrestrial or aquatic animals or plants, from the disposal of unused antimicrobials, or from antimicrobial manufacturing waste and wastewater. And all of these may promote resistance by creating conditions that are favorable to the transfer or emergence of new resistance genes. And this is particularly important in the agricultural sector, where we know that there's a large amount of antimicrobials that are used in animal production, and that it is necessary to protect the health of the livestock of farmers and also used in plants as well. And it's particularly important to recognize how up to 80% of antimicrobial doses administered can be excreted as active compounds or metabolites, depending on the class of antimicrobials and how it is used. And wastewater treatment is often insufficient or not possible. And as we know with human health in human medicine, we try to focus on the fact that prevention is better than cure. So while it's very difficult to remove antimicrobial compounds that could contribute to environmental AMR when it's already in aquatic ecosystems, we try to focus more on preventing the waste from entering the environment in the first place. And so improving waste and wastewater treatment mechanisms, improving enhanced environmental governance planning and regulatory frameworks, and identifying and targeting priority AMR relevant pollutants are the best mitigation strategies that we're currently working towards. And while we do have large research gaps that still exist today, we do have enough knowledge to be able to act now, especially with basic levels of wash and wastewater treatment, and especially with agricultural runoff, and focusing on animal husbandry, good husbandry practices to reduce the need for antimicrobial use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. I will go to Richard, UNEP. So Richard, you coordinate the World Water Quality Alliance of the UNEP program, and emerging pollutants represent a global water quality challenge of growing concern and which pose threats to world's ecosystems. So UNEP is the global environmental agenda setting authority. So Could you please tell us about UNEP's strategies on emerging pollutants and how UNEP supports countries in addressing emerging pollutants? Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me to this high-level panel. And thank you again also to the co-presenters here. So from the perspective of the United Nations Environment Programme, and more specifically the World Water Quality Alliance, what we're trying to do is to convert all of the data which is collected, all of the information which is collected at a national, at a subnational, and at a supranational level, which then feeds into, shall we say, supranational strategies, or at least ambitions. And what we try to do is that we convert that into local tangible results. So we place a lot of emphasis, first of all, on the transition from data to action based on proven scientific fact. And the means that we've been doing that, especially over the last 24 months, is by placing an emphasis, an important emphasis on the local community, which for a supranational agency is easier to do than it may appear at first sight. And so what we have done is that we have been reaching out to local communities for a number of reasons. First of all, it is absolutely essential, in our opinion, from the World Water Quality Alliance, that in order to tackle all environmental issues, all water-based issues, and certainly the issue of emerging pollutants, that it is necessary to create awareness at a local level. But once you've created that awareness, you're also creating an interest and a desire to seek solutions. We also, at the same time, have a need to understand specific local situations and what those conditions and what those factors are, which are leading to those specific local conditions. Therefore, what we try to do from the very beginning is engage what we call in politics, because I'm a political scientist, the quintuple helix. In other words, the public sector, the private sector, the research sector, and then two of the sectors which are perhaps most influential. The cultural sector as a means of dissemination of communication and the means of bringing into play the hitherto uninformed layperson, for a start. And then, of course, the citizen sector themselves. And what we aim through that is an action of, first of all, the co-identification of problems, then the co-creation of solutions at a local community level or at a subnational level, then the co-implementation, which also involves the non-expert, because a non-expert, although they can't be technically qualified, shall we say, to provide the specific solutions on the ground, they do become the communicators to their local community and beyond. Furthermore, as well, they become a guarantee of something which is absolutely essential in any environmental policy, which is the question of policy continuity. Far too often in many different countries, initiatives or programs are begun either by local governments or regional governments or national governments, and then immediately become, shall we say, subject to the political changes that may or may not pass during the time period that you want to actually implement that policy. The other problem, which has been clearly identified around the world as well, is the fact that if you don't have a broad social consensus, then you are never actually going to be able to create effective citizen science, which is also for us an extremely important part of the equation. And citizen science cannot be the result of, once again, an individual project or a research institute, or indeed a government agency parachuting into a community without really connecting to the community or listening to the community, but rather imposing a certain number of measures, perhaps saying that if they give a couple of workshops or they give a few test tubes so that local citizens or school children collect samples, they think that they're actually engaging, but they're not. For us, it's absolutely essential that effective citizen engagement also becomes effective and long-term citizen science, so that you have people who are not only aware of the problem, they understand why they are involved, and you are giving them an active role in that solution. then you can guarantee continuity, and then you can guarantee tangible results. Finally, we've also discovered as well that as a result of this, the capacity for emergency response is much stronger and much more effective. And so that we can, rather than developing strategies that only apply, shall we say, to a very broad regional level, that we can also go more specifically into crisis points at any given moment. And finally, as a byproduct of all of this, we have discovered over the last few years that this has also led to a very strong basis of what we identify as science cultural diplomacy. I'm also working very closely, for example, with the European Commission, the Joint Research Centre, and we have a program called Renaissance, where this use of science-based citizen engagement to approach issues, especially such as, for example, emerging pollutants and other water quality-based issues, can not only be a source of tangible results, but also as a source of different communities who would otherwise be in conflict, recognizing a mutual problem within their region or indeed beyond, and therefore working together. And this, I believe, is more possible than ever at the local community level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for highlighting the role of culture as a means of awareness raising and also citizen engagement, and that's very important for UNESCO as well, and also highlighting the role of citizen science and science cultural diplomacy to co-identify problems and co-develop solutions. That's very important. So I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Molwantwa. You lead the World Water Research Commission of South Africa, which is a leading research and knowledge hub, not only in South Africa, but also in Africa region. So my question is how to mobilize research and knowledge for and across Africa. I'm highlighting the word for as well, to intending the North-South scientific cooperation, as well as across Africa, in order to shape policies on emerging pollutants on both freshwater and marine ecosystems. And because emerging pollutants are not only a problem in freshwater, but also they end up in coastal waters and the ocean. Also, the emerging pollutants is an emerging research field. So how to strengthen scientific and research capabilities on emerging pollutants in Africa? It is still in early stage. In this conference, we had several presentations, but I think we also need to strengthen the research capacity. Over to you, Dr. Jennifer.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. And thank you very much. Welcome also to my co-panelists. I think this is a very important subject matter that we are discussing today. But yes, key to mobilization of research and knowledge across Africa starts, I think, from member countries. I think South Africa is considered a leading country in Africa in terms of its economy, in terms of research, in terms of development. And therefore, what then is at the core of ensuring that there is mobilization really starts with collaboration, starts with participation, starts with engagement, interaction, networking between not only high level, at high level ministerial, but even its researchers, as technical experts, as a people. So it becomes very much important that we're able to collaborate and share the messages around the emerging contaminants. But I've also always said that we are not living in an island in Africa, and therefore, air and soils and water are very fluid and they are always moving. And therefore, we need to also rely on research that has been done elsewhere to look at signs of what could these emerging contaminants be. And then we need to be able to repurpose our research and our resources, which are very limited, to say, how then do we start looking at these areas of emerging concern? I think what we have found to be a bit of a challenge is that you may find that 5 universities across the region are not collaborating. They are spending the equal amount of resources to research the same subjects, whereas one could be looking at chemicals, others could be looking at agrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, etc. But also we need to be quite proactive in terms of what really do we need to find out, take into consideration the limitation of resources. So we should be able to look at what are our detection limits and what are we looking for? And when we can find evidence that is significant and convincing, then where do we go from there? One of the first things that we need to be able to do is to influence our legislation and our regulation with the different departments. So we are in the water sector, a leading water research, but there's also agricultural sector, a research entity, there's also other entities. But we need to start sharing information, having dialogues and saying these emerging contaminants are here and how do we work around it? We need to also have interdepartmental, so the different departments of government needs to be involved. We need to identify what is coming upstream, particularly in the water space, and what is going downstream, to be able to say how then do we start monitoring, having standardized methodologies, having similar infrastructure to be able to detect. And once we have done that, we need to influence policy at government level. But the critical aspect is that you may find that in business and the economic sector that there is a pushback around this kind of messaging because there's always benefits to using some chemicals over others. Now we need to also be very proactive around what alternatives are there. You don't just say, here is the danger, you know, and get everybody scared. The community needs to be educated and made aware so that they can be mobilized to also demand better from their governments. But other than that, it's also to educate the economy, the economic drivers and the users, as well as those people that are manufacturing and selling, but also start doing research around what interventions, what alternatives, what options, and define for ourselves these matters. But where it does not work, we need to be able to ensure that there is compliance, there is enforcement of the compliance, and there is really a deterrent. It's not just something that says, you know, you may be fined 1,000 rands. 1,000 rands to a big corporation might be nothing, but the lives of communities and future generations would be at stake. So it's really important that we start from within, we spread across, we collaborate, and we integrate and share our results. You know, gone is the time for scientific competition, but rather for using science to collect data, to turn it into information and decision for the betterment of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And you have highlighted the very important point of scientific collaboration and sharing the results of scientific results. And that's actually one of the key objectives of this conference. And also, thank you for highlighting the importance of influencing legislations and policies. And that actually leads to my next question to Dr. Ting Ruan from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So you are a scientist and you work in one of the leading research centers of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So what is the role of scientists in supporting and shaping national policies on water and environmental issues? And could you please share the China's experience on the research on emerging pollutants and how research findings are communicated and shared with decision makers for science-based policy making? Over to you, Dr. Ting Ruan.
Good afternoon. Many thanks to the conference for the invitation, and thank you very much for the question. I am an analytical chemistry researcher, so my answer will be mainly based on my experience and my understanding. The research of environmental organic pollutants has long history, which could be dated back to the 1960s to 70s. The research of emerging pollutants were widespread in the 1990s to the 2000s. The two categories of organic pollutants that receive the most attention are the persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors. These two categories have wide global impact, and the representative events associated with these are the publication of the Silent Spring and Our Stormy Future. So the earliest research program on emerging pollutant in China began almost at the same time, around in the 2001. And the first project was funded by the National High-Tech Research Program, with aims to screen and control the endocrine disruptors. It was followed by 3 continuous national basic research program that begins in around 2003 and continued for 50 years. And the first 2 programs focus on the event behaviors and toxicity effects of persistent organic pollutants. And with knowledge gained in the previous programs, the final program was involved to address the issue of the emerging organic pollutants. And the focus was mainly based on the regional characterization, the screening, and the environmental risks assessment and the control principles. And also a major research program started last year, mainly focused on the resistant genes. And these scientific topics and research objectives are first proposed by scientists who won and were funded in competition with topics of all scientific areas. And these projects have counted scientists with the professional skills and have defined the scope of the target analysis of the research of emerging pollutants in researchers in China. And when the project was finished, a large amount of information was integrated to form several conclusions. I think this is important. In terms of how effective this scientific result has shared with the policymakers, I think it could be reflected by the policies that has been subsequently established, because it could be useful to show what information the policymakers have been received and what they think are important, right? And for example, in the latest 5-year plan for China's national economy and social development, the control of emerging pollutants is listed for the first time as the national strategy for environmental protection. And this means that the adverse effects of emerging pollutants on the people's health are aware. And this strategy could also be one of the effective means to balance economic development and the environment safety. And in the list of the key control pollutants to be implemented March this year, and the main substances are focused on the persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disruptors and antibiotics. I think it's a good start. Because these types of substances are at least part of the most important pollutants in China. The Ministry of Ecology and Environment has included all of the persistent organic pollutants in the national monitoring program. These require a lot of efforts because the large-scale capacity building and the skill training are very challenging. But this decision showed that it may be more valuable to obtain enough data to get statistic significant conclusions, such as the health adverse recommended values for various kinds of pollutants to fit the conditions of our country. The ministry has also made the screening and prioritization of thousands kind of other organic pollutants as its priority in its work. This is important because this is the main scientific issue at hand. In other words, to focus on a few kind of key control pollutants is not enough. The screening and presentation strategy could help understand the quality and range of the emerging pollutants in China and which substances should be focused in the follow-up actions. In addition, in the list of the key control pollutants, special emphasis is placed on the needs to strictly control the sales of prescription antibiotics and to promote the mechanisms of the prescription for the limited use of agricultural antimicrobial agents. This is very important, I think. And this decision showed that this is the effective control strategies for specific kind of pollutants that could be controlled at the source. So this is my understanding. Thank you for the region.
Thank you, Dr. Ting, and I think we should congratulate your country for including emerging pollutants in the National Development Strategy, a 5-year strategy. I think that's a very good start and very good milestone, because in many countries, it's not even reflected in water sector policies. So thank you all our speakers for this very specific points related to emerging pollutants from different sectoral or different international organizations point of view. But I also would like to now ask a question to all of you, the same question, and I would like to ask you to answer about the global scientific and policy consensus on emerging pollutants. So Dr. Jennifer has highlighted that we need to have a scientific consensus, and Dr. Omar also highlighted that yes, there are knowledge gaps, but we have enough evidence to develop some policies. So how to build a scientific and policy consensus on emerging pollutants and on best ways to address these pollutants, given that we have limited scientific knowledge, given that the research is at early stage, and we have a lack of global or regional or national policies, except a few countries like China or South Africa. So I would like to start with Dr. Omar.
Thank you very much, Sarantuyaa. And yes, I think that this is a very important question, especially for emerging pollutants and for topics that are still being researched and still have quite a few research gaps. But one of the best ways that we can move forward, especially with environmental AMR and with the fact that research is always ongoing, is to at least make sure that everybody is at the table, to really bring all the environmental stakeholders together and to have everyone understand that we all have key roles in addressing environmental AMR. For example, developing strong and achievable regulatory frameworks to reduce AMR relevant discharges into the environment and to promote sustainable production and consumption patterns. So enhancing environmental governance, planning and regulatory frameworks, and making sure that, specifically for environmental AMR, that including ministries of environment and environmental agencies in developing national action plans so that we all can agree on what are the main targets we should be working towards and how can we get there together and how can we ensure that we are sharing knowledge between all of relevant groups, research universities, academic institutions, private public institutions, and governments as well, to make sure that no stone is being uncovered or unturned, let's say, because knowledge will come from everywhere and especially from the most unsuspecting places as well. And I feel that committing ourselves as a global community to being open with research, with knowledge, not trading, but sharing information and putting things into the public space for discourse so that we can grow together as a community is one of the most important things for generating that consensus is on topics, especially topics that are constantly and very quickly evolving and changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you for highlighting this multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach. And next, Richard, over to you.
Yes, I was actually really delighted to hear what Omar has just said. And I was also extremely pleased to hear what Jennifer said as well before in her initial discourse. And allow me to play a little bit the devil's advocate. I've been in environmental politics for approximately 20 years. I've attended and I've spoken at probably thousands of conferences. And there are a lot of very well-intentioned messages, but we are also faced with certain realities, which I believe that we really must confront very honestly. So I agree 100% with what Omar has said. One of the reasons why we look to work with all of the social sectors at a local community, subnational, national, and supranational level is in order to try and create that socio-political consensus, which is necessary, as I said before, for continuity. But I think that there are also other conditions that we need to face and that we need to be honest about. First of all, Jennifer very rightly pointed out the value of knowledge exchange. And also it's necessary at the same time to avoid duplication of action. There are so many times when, for example, funded projects which are undertaken by research institutes are basically just a repetition of a successful formula which they have already done before, but which they are repeating because they know then that they're going to get funding and so therefore maintain their researchers employed. That is not helping society as a whole. And so one of the things that I would ask all the supranational agencies to do is to make sure that when they are creating public funding calls, to oblige those who are creating proposals to have demonstrated that they have read the previous work and so that they can build on it rather than just repeat it in different words. Knowledge exchange itself requires generosity and honesty. Researchers are not famous for being generous with their work. And again, this is another reality. I'm going to be making a lot of friends with this talk. But again, this is a reality that we do have to face. I think it's something that, and I've been saying this to the science community for many years now, they do have to understand that just as any other sector of society, they are social political actors. They have a role to take. They must step up with their expertise and with their knowledge, but they must be generous with that. And they must be open with their knowledge. I know an awful lot of scientists. I work with scientists every day, and they're sometimes far more concerned about how many peer-reviewed articles they've published that year than instead of if the information, the data, or indeed the solutions that they have so nobly created are actually being applied at a practical level. And I think that that's a bridge that we need to cross, and we need to cross it very quickly, because the issue in this case of emerging pollutants is an urgent one. And I think we're being sometimes far too polite to our colleagues. And the last thing I would just say as well, and this is something that Jennifer also slightly mentioned, and Omar, when he's talking about a broad global consensus, which I agree with 100% is important, is the fact that politicians have their own agenda. We have to be realistic. We have to understand that we don't live in a perfect world. I'm not just a political scientist, I've also been a politician. And so I do know the psyche of the political mind to a certain extent. Therefore, we need to ensure that our needs and our desires are woven into their objectives from the very beginning, not only of their mandates, but also from the very beginning of the creation of their own political programs. I agree with enforcement as well, as Jennifer mentioned, but at the same time, enforcement can only come as a result of decision makers deciding to do that. And in order for that to happen, public opinion and public awareness requires to be more effective than multinational corporate financial pressure.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you also highlighting the importance of building a social political consensus in addition to scientific and policy consensus. So for Jennifer, over to you, and I think you can also interact with the comments from Richard and Omar.
Thank you very much. I think, colleagues, we really, I am quite amused by what Richard is saying, because I think it's really hitting the reality that as experts and the scientific community, we may have these ideals, but the practicalities on the ground are really quite difficult to handle. And I think for me, Hence, I have mentioned education and awareness of population. You know, it's so critical, and we have seen this through this recent COVID-19 pandemic, because there was a message that was consistent globally from the top all the way to the ground. People tend from their normal ways to the adherence to COVID regulations overnight. And I think that becomes very critical. I mean, I speak for in South Africa and Africa, particularly, where you may find that a lot of the population is not even an elite or aware of certain issues that have may be deemed very technical. But with COVID, everybody understood what the message was. And therefore, we can never underplay the insistence and consistent push towards educating and enlightening communities, starting with children, making sure that the message is something that becomes universal and people understand. Because once people understand and they understand the impact of action or non-action on their lives, then you start seeing people taking to the streets, or at least demonstrating, or at least asking for questions. And we cannot underplay that. And therefore that makes also us responsible as scientists to ensure that we are not only sensationalizing things, but we are breaking it down from a technical aspect, making it realistic, making people aware that it may not affect you now, but it may affect future generations, giving practical examples of the realities that people are living with. We at the WRC also further fund research and development, and we fund researchers. And, you know, for a very long time, we have also relied on researchers to drive the research agenda and indicate to us what they are looking for, what they want to research. I think what research also, what research Richard highlighted was that there needs to be some kind of a forced marriage wherein we insist that the work or the research that's been proposed must have a basis on work that's been done elsewhere. And therefore, how are you taking this work forward? So we need to also shift our thinking around more towards targeted research, especially around this area. We have been fortunate to have started this work in South Africa, funding some of the work. And recently, we have now started collaborating with the Department of Environmental Affairs in making sure that they don't also fund the research that we have already funded, but that we offer them the research results and the reports and say, you get your next studies to to start from this point and take the work forward. So that becomes very much important. But I think consensus around the globe is can only be attained when we start linking this to human health impacts, because when people start understanding how their health and the health of future generations will be impacted, that is when they also become awoken to the challenges, and they can be able to start holding the politicians to account. But also academic freedom in terms of most of the countries, you find that universities practice what we call academic freedom. Researchers can write opinion pieces. We need to be more visible and stop hiding behind data and information and not being out there. The world today requires scientific-based evidence for decision-making purposes, and we need to really drive that and ensure that we keep the message alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And also both of you, Richard and Jennifer, for highlighting the importance of research to generate new knowledge instead of duplicating the research that has already been done. And that's very important. And Dr. Ting Ruan, over to you.
Many thanks. My quick answer to the question is that I think the past knowledge and experience from the so-called traditional pollutants are still valid, at least for the organic pollutants. The emergent pollutants are not completely different substances from those of the traditional ones. In some widely accepted definition of the contaminant of emergent concern, one reason for the observation of these emergent pollutants is due to the advances of analytical methodologies. For instance, the development of high-resolution mass spectrometry enables scientists to detect more pollutants simultaneously and without the limitations such as the variability of a chemical standard. So I can give two examples of how this past knowledge still works. The first one is that there is a scientific consensus that the pollutants which have a sustained and significant impact on the environment could have the right combination of the physical chemical properties, which are governed by the molecular structures. So the environmental scientists are still using the dimensions of persistency, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. In other words, the PBT criteria to discern whether a chemical could be potential emerging pollutants. Even for the newer and the less bioaccumulative substances, such as the very persistent and very mobile substances, the P and T property are still necessary. This is also true for the adverse biological impacts. Based on the test of the multiple endpoints for water quality assessment, the results of the current studies in North America and in China suggested that the estrogenic effect is still one of the main ecological impacts of organic pollutants, especially in small runoff with insufficient dilution multiples. So all these findings are consistent with previous experience. The PBT criteria was used to define the POPs in the Stockholm Convention back in the 2000s. The endocrine disrupting effects received attention in the 1990s. But today, we have a better means to demonstrate this importance of this kind of pollutants, and we have the opportunity to identify the main contributing components. So that's all my answer. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Ruan. And also, yes, from this conference, some sessions also highlighted that there is a converging consensus on certain pollutants such as PFAS, which are very persistent and mobile, etc. So there were very interesting comments in your responses about Richard mentioned about we have to be generous in sharing knowledge. You also mentioned about the scientific diplomacy. Jennifer mentioned about the scientific freedom, and also we heard about this lots of comments about how to translate knowledge into policy and into practice. So UNESCO promotes open science, and open science is a new concept, and the member states of UNESCO adopted the UNESCO recommendation on open science. So this conference is an example of how to put open science into practice. So the open science is actually a tool to facilitate open sharing of scientific data results. But can we go beyond the scientific community, and can open science be a tool to communicate scientific knowledge, research, and findings to the citizens? All of you mentioned the importance of educating citizens, awareness raising, or even the policymakers, both from the bottom and the top, in order to build policies on emerging pollutants. So very quickly, 1 minute, and afterwards I would like to leave time to answer some questions in the question and answer boxes. Thank you. We will start with Richard, because you have been talking about this a lot. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Open source information is absolutely vital, but more than importantly than anything else, it has to be accessible. And I don't mean it has to be accessible that people know where it is. It means that ordinary citizens, the private sector, the cultural sector, anybody can access it because they can understand what they're reading. I'm not asking for information to be dumbed down. What I am asking for is that scientists are now trained from the very beginning, even when they're at university, to please be able to communicate in simple terms what they are finding and how they propose those solutions. I myself, I've been the head of politics of a research center for the last 12 years. I'm now working as the coordinator here at the United Nations Environment Program, the World Water Quality Alliance. I am the perfect litmus test for my colleagues. I say to my scientific colleagues, if you write it and I understand it, then it can go public. If not, go back and rewrite it again. And for example, at the moment, we're creating the World Water Quality Assessment. And one of the things that we have done is to make sure that the language that we employ is based on progressive dissemination, so that first of all, at the entrance stage, it can be accessible to everybody because of the language employed. If the experts want more in-depth information, then they can click on and go in. But what we cannot afford is to have excellent information and data wasted simply because the majority of society do not understand what they are reading or what they're listening to.
Thank you, Richard. Accessibility means also communicating better to policymakers and other stakeholders. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think just to add on what Richard said, I mean, everyone, almost every second person in the world has got a smartphone, has got an application. In these applications, we've got social media, we have got adverts. We really need to start also capitalizing on these spaces to communicate simply as Richard said, but also to make sure that we penetrate and reach a larger majority. Definitely data needs to be available in the most practical form. You know, you can have your technical data, your raw data, but simplify it, go to the point and the extent of using audio visuals to just show what the science means, and people will get to understand. Politicians are also people, they're not necessarily technical. Most of them, in fact, in our country are not. But once you start explaining it in terms that is easily understandable, then it will start reaching their humanity. And I think in that way, they'll be able to take better decisions and action around what needs to be done in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Dr. Ting Ruan.
Okay, I have the similar opinions. I think the focus of interest of scientists and the policymakers may be different. A scientist want to have access to more data to facilitate a comprehensive understanding of the object of the research. This is particularly true for emerging pollutants. For example, I think the researchers in Europe and China had roughly concluded that there are only a few individual chemicals that have a significant ecological impact. Nevertheless, over a larger range of substances, the risk of combined effects elevates as the number of observed pollutants increase. Thus, to have as much knowledge as possible on the composition in pollutant mixtures is important for scientists. However, decision makers may prefer to obtain fewer and clear scientific conclusions. This may be because large amounts of social resources need to be assembled to implement a policy. So therefore, I think besides the emphasis on the data transparency and availability, a mechanism is needed to encourage the summarization and or the translation of the large amount of the detailed research data into a small number of scientific conclusions. These conclusions could be, for example, what are the biological effects or endpoints that should be the most concern? What kind of the most frequently occurring structural layers or toxic pores of all the pollutants in the environment? Or what kind of common physical chemical properties of the emerged pollutants in a specific region to facilitate the design of abatement policies? That is all my answer. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting the importance of synthesizing the huge amount of data for policymakers. Omar, over to you about open science.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to also reiterate and agree with that the notion that scientific communication skills are very important. And this is the way that most people will be able to understand data and openly shared data. And I think it's also, especially when looking at antimicrobial resistance, and especially in the environment as an emerging pollutant, that it's also very important to have, reputable, valid data that is also being shared, and then also standardized data so that you can actually compare different sources of data to your specific situation, your country, your region, and so forth. And I feel that it's also important to try to make sure that we have data that we can compare and use from all over the world. And that having open data it's really important to support member countries, to support stakeholders, especially policymakers, in a way that is also very much accessible to them. And this is a reason why FAO, not only just as FAO, for example, with Aquastat, it's a global information system on water resources, collecting and analyzing and providing free access to member countries so that they can use this data to contribute to and deliver evidence-based policy decisions. And also why FAO also working within the quadripartite with UNEP, WHO, and WOA to provide integrated surveillance systems that provides this open source data to not only scientists and researchers, but specifically also for policymakers, because as Jennifer had noted, many policymakers are not specifically the technical people, the technical experts in all of the fields. And there are just too many subjects for someone to be a technical expert in all of them. And it's also our role and our responsibility as scientists to be able to convey this information in an understandable way so that we can approach their humanity and also with a true evidence-based scientific basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, for highlighting the importance of comparable standardized data, and this has been highlighted in several presentations. So over to you, Karishma, I think we have many questions, and please address the questions to our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, and I must say that was a very intriguing and informative panel. Well, the questions are of course being answered, but one question that's come from Lucy, where she mentions about in how many countries is the regulation on water contamination still not present? What are the chances of getting a stronger law enforcement across various countries? In fact, Jennifer and Richard, both of you did talk about the importance of having law and enforcement power over this aspect. Would you like to address that?
After you, Jennifer, if you wish. I mean, from my perspective, very, very, very quickly, I would say that the only way that you are going to be able to convince national governments to act on the science data is by making sure that there is also sufficient pressure, not only from above, from the supranational agencies and from regional pressures, from the evidence of the science, but also from below. This is one of the reasons why we work at the beginning from local communities. So it becomes a bottom-up policy, because a bottom-top policy, because otherwise what you're going to find is that there will be politicians who always are open to these subjects such as emerging pollutants. And there are equally going to be a large number who are not going to be open to discussing them unless they feel that it is, shall we say, politically more sensible to do so. So therefore, you do have to create pressure from bottom top, in my opinion.
Okay.
I think it's also very important to note that from both sides of the camp, those that are benefiting from emerging contaminants and those that may be impacted by emerging contaminants, there's always going to be loggerheads. There's always, so the science, evidence and data and information that is provided is critical, that it is not sensationalized, but it is accurate and can be duplicated and can be tested, so that carries so much weight that when civil society and non-governmental organizations start taking governments to task around non-action, then there may be evidence that can really be used to stand the ground. Also, the other side of the fence must really be convinced, and not only from a point of bashing, utilizing chemicals or other other things that may result in contaminants of emerging concerns. There also needs to be a concerted effort in finding what are the alternatives, because we need to acknowledge the fact that most of the emerging contaminants were not necessarily as a result of doing harm. Some of them are in pharmaceuticals, some of them are in cosmetics. It was as a result of using a chemical for the betterment or for a certain benefit. And over time, these have now come and been realized as having certain concerns or certain areas of impact that may be negative. And therefore, in working towards solutions, we really have to be focusing on then what else may be done so that the economy is not destroyed, businesses are not destroyed, but we work towards common benefit while not destroying benefits. I think for me that becomes very much critical, the objectivity around it. And in central to it in Africa, we call it Ubuntu, where you consider humans and others first before money and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that. We do have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we're a bit short on time. So we will answer the questions, and you can find these answers, in fact, on the website. And I'm going to just quickly sum up the whole session. In fact, there are 5 to 6 significant keywords that I've collected through the collaboration that we have done today. Let me use the words that all of you did use today. And consensus, inclusion, multi-stakeholder approach, network, diplomacy, and scientific collaboration are the key tools and techniques that are going to kind of take the way forward when it comes to bringing science and policy making together. Thank you very much, speakers, for being with us on this. Over to you, Sarantuyaa, for final words.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, this panel discussion has highlighted the importance of how we do the research. And I remember that when UNESCO started this small project on emerging pollutants back in 2009 and 10, we hardly could find research on emerging pollutants in other regions than Europe and North America. But today, this conference, we have so many research and high quality research from Africa, from India, Asia, Latin America, or from all over the world. And this actually shows that research is being developed in this area. And so now maybe, as our high level panel speakers have highlighted, we have to also think about how to do the research. And many of the presentations focused on monitoring and identification of emerging pollutants. And our speakers have highlighted that we need research on solutions, and also not to duplicate the research that has been done, but to do new research, to generate new knowledge. So please also what you have done, communicate it in a better way, in an open way, be generous, and also communicate in a language that is accessible not only to policymakers, but also to everyone as citizens. So with this, I would like to thank all our distinguished panelists for sharing your views, insights, and experience, and it has been an excellent panel. And I hope that our scientists who are attending this conference will take on board your message for their next research. Thank you. So we will have our next session. And Karishma, would you like to announce our next session? And that is, I think, in 15 minutes, or maybe now it's in 12 minutes. It's a very new concept as well, on the circular economy approach, life cycle management of emerging pollutants, and this session is going to be moderated by OECD. So thank you all our attendants and speakers.